Chapter 4 is called Cernus. "Place your first sword before me," I said, "that I may kill him." Cernus of Ar, of the house of Cernus, studied me, his large face impassive, his eyes revealing nothing, like grey stones. His large hands rested over the arms of the curved curule chair in which he sat, which was mounted on a platform of stone, about 1 foot high and 12 feet square. In the base of the platform there were mounted 6 slave rings. Cernus of Ar wore a coarse black robe, woven probably from the wool of the bounding 2-legged hert, a domesticated marsupial raised in large numbers in the environs of several of Gor's northern cities. The hert, raised on large fenced ranches, herded by domesticated slain and sheared by chained slaves, replaces its wool 4 times a year. The house of Cernus, I had heard, had interests in several of the hert ranches near the city. The black of the garment of Cernus was broken only by 3 stripes of silk sewn lengthwise on his left sleeve, 2 stripes of blue enclosing 1 of yellow. When I had spoken, several of the men of Cernus had shifted in uneasily. Some grasped their weapons. "I am first sword in the house of Cernus," said Cernus. The room in which I stood was the hall of the house of Cernus. It was a large room, some 70 feet square, with a ceiling of some 50 feet in height. Set in the wall to my left, as in the base of the stone platform, were slave rings, a dozen or so. The room was innocent of the energy bulbs of the caste of builders. In the walls were torch racks. There were now no torches. The room was lit, and greyly, by sunlight now filtering in through several narrow barred windows set very high in the thick stone of the walls. It reminded me, in its way, of a room in a prison, and such in its way it was, for it was a room in the house of Cernus, greatest of the slave houses of Ar. Cernus wore about his neck on a golden chain a medallion which bore the crest of the house of Cernus, a tarn with slave chains grasped in its talons. Behind Cernus, on the wall, there hung a large tapestry, richly done in red and gold, which bore the same sign. "I have come," I said, "to rent my sword to the house of Cernus." "We have been expecting you," said Cernus. I revealed no sign of surprise. "It is understood by me," said Cernus, evidently relying certain reports which had reached him, "that Portus, of the house of Portus, sought to hire your sword in vain." "It is true," I said. Cernus smiled. "Otherwise," he said, "you surely would not have come here, for in this house we are innocent." This was an allusion to the mark which I wore on my forehead. I had spent the night following the game in an inn, had washed away the mark, and this morning early, when I had arisen, had placed it again on my forehead. After a bit of cold bosque, some water, and a handful of peas, I had come to the house of Cernus. It was not yet the 7th Korean hour, but already the slaver was up, conducting his affairs, when I had been ushered into his presence. At his right hand there was a scribe, an angular sullen man with deep eyes and a stylus. It was Capris of Ar, chief accountant to the house of Cernus. He lived in the house and seldom went abroad in the streets. It was with this man that Vela had been placed, her registration, papers, and purchase having been arranged. In the house of Cernus, after the sheet, bracelets, leash, and collar had been removed, agents of the house of Cernus had checked her fingerprints against those on the papers. She had then been examined thoroughly by the physicians of the house of Cernus. and then, found acceptable, she had knelt while agents of the house signed the receipt of her delivery and endorsed her papers, retaining one set and giving one set to the seller's agent for forwarding to the cylinder of documents. Then she had submitted herself to the house of Kernus, kneeling before one of its agents, lowering her head, extending her arms, wrists crossed. She had then been collared and turned over to Capris to be combed and cleaned, for the smell of the pens was on her. She was given 2 sets of slave livery and instructed in her duties. Capris was said to be a friend of Priest King's. There had been no difficulty, it seemed, in placing Vella in the house of Kernus, and yet I feared for her safety. It was a dangerous game. "And may I inquire," asked Kernus, "for whom you wear on your forehead the mark of the black dagger?" I would speak of these things to some extent with Kernus, for it was important, though perilous, that he should understand what purported to be my mission. It was now time that certain things should be revealed, that they might leak into the streets of Ar. "I came," I said, "to avenge Tal Cabot, he of Koraba." There were cries of astonishment from the men-at-arms. I smiled to myself. I had little doubt but that in an Arn the story would be in all the Parga taverns of Arn, on all the bridges, and in all the cylinders. "In this city," said Kernus, "Tal Cabot, he of Koraba, is known as Tal of Bristol." "Yes," I said. "I have heard sing of him," said Kernus. I observed the slaver closely. He seemed troubled, shocked. 2 of his men rushed from the room. I heard them shouting in the corridors of the house. "I regret to hear it," said Kernus at last, and then he looked at me. "And there will be few in Ar who would not wish you well in your dark work." "Who would kill Tal of Bristol?" cried out a man-at-arms, not even thinking that Kernus had not acknowledged his right to speak. "A knife on the high bridge," I said, "in the vicinity of the cylinder of warriors, at the 20th, in the darkness and in the shadow of lamps." The men-at-arms looked at one another. "It could only have been so," said one. I myself felt bitterly about a poorly lit bridge in the vicinity of the cylinder of warriors, and about an hour on a certain day, for it was on that bridge that a young man of the warriors had walked, perhaps not then a quarter of an hour before myself, before I would have passed that way. His crime, if he had had one, was that his build was rather like me, and his hair in the shadows, the half-darkness of the lamps and the 3 moons of Gore, might have seemed to one who watched like mine. The older Tal, the Korabian master of arms, and myself had found the body, and near it the patch of green caught in a crack in the grille-work of one of the lamps on the bridge, where perhaps it had been torn from the shoulder of a running, stumbling man. The older Tal had turned the body over in his hands, and we looked on it, and both of us regarded one another. "This knife," said the older Tal, "was to have been yours." "Do you know him?" I asked. "No," he said, "other than the fact that he was a warrior from the allied city of Fentis, a poor warrior." We noted that his pouch had not been cut. The killer had wanted only the life. The older Tal, taking the knife by the hand guard, withdrew it. It was a throwing knife of the sort used in Ar, much smaller than the southern quiver, and tapered only on one side. It was a knife designed for killing. Mixed with the blood and fluids of the body, there was a smear of white at the end of the steel, the softened residue of a glaze of Kanda paste, now melted by body heat, which had coated the tip of the blade. On the hilt of the dagger, curling about, was the legend, "I have sought him, I have found him." It was a killing knife. "The caste of the assassins?" I asked. "Unlikely," said the older Tal, "for assassins commonly are too proud for poison." and then, not speaking, the older Taller slung the body over his shoulders. I took the patch from the grill work. We took the body, fortunately meeting no one at that late hour, to the nearby compartment of my father, Matthew Cabot, administrator of the city. The older Tal, my father, and I long discussed the matter. We were confident that this attempt on my life, for that it seemed to be, had something to do with the Sardar and the priest-kings and the others, not priest-kings who desired this world of priest-kings and men, and surreptitiously and cruelly were fighting to obtain it, though as yet perhaps fearing the power of the priest-kings, and not fully understanding how severely it had been reduced in the Nest War of more than a year ago. They had not dared to attack openly. Accordingly, biding our time, we let it be thought in the city that Tal Cabot had been slain. And now, in the hall of the house of Cernus, my thoughts became bitter. I had indeed come to avenge, but I didn't even know his name. He had been a townsman of Thentis. He had come to the allied city of Cordoba, and there had found his death. For no reason, it was clear to me, other than the fact that he had had the misfortune to resemble me. "Why," asked Cernus, breaking into my reverie, "why did not the warriors of Cordoba come to Ar to search out the killer?" It was not an act of war," I said. Further, I pointed out, now that Kazarak of Port Car is no longer administrator of Ar, it seemed unlikely that Ar would welcome Cordoban warriors within her walls. "Yes, true," said one of the men-at-arms. "And do you know the name of the man whom you seek?" asked Cernus. "I have only this," I said, drawing forth from my belt the wrinkled patch of green cloth. "It is a faction patch," said Cernus. "There are thousands of such in Ar." "It's all I have," I said. "This house itself," said Cernus, "is allied with the faction of the Greens, as certain other houses and various of the establishments of the city are associated with other factions." "I know," I said. "I know that the house of Cernus is allied with the Greens." "I now see that there is more reason than I suspected in your desire to rent your sword in this house." "Yes," I said. "For all I know, the man I seek may be of this house." "It is unlikely, though," said Cernus, "for those who favour the Greens are numbered in the thousands, and come from all the castes of Gore. The administrator of Ar himself and the high initiate are partisans of the Green." I shrugged. "But you are welcome in this house," said Cernus. "As you presumably know, these are difficult times in Ar, and a good sword is a good investment, and steel in these days is upon occasion more valuable than gold." I nodded. "I will upon occasion have commissions for you." And he looked down on me. "But for the time," he said, "it is valuable for me simply for it to be known that your sword is in this house." "I await your commands," I said. "You will shortly be shown to your quarters," said Cernus, gesturing to a nearby man-at-arms, and I turned to follow him. "Incidentally," he said, "Killer." I turned to face him. "It is known to me that in the tavern of Spindius you slew 4 warriors of the house of Portus." I said nothing. 4 pieces of gold," said Cernus, "double tons, will be sent to your rooms." I nodded my head. "Also," said Cernus, "it is understood by me that you picked up one of my gals in the street." I tensed slightly, my hand dropping to the hilt of the short sword. "What was her number?" Cernus was asking Capris, who stood near him. 74673, said the scribe. I had anticipated that there would be some mention of Vela, for it was unlikely that Cernus would be unaware of my contact with her. Indeed, I had instructed her, when she had returned late to the house of Kerners, to bewail and protest what had theoretically happened to her in no uncertain terms. Accordingly, I was not surprised that the scribe had her number ready for Kerners. Moreover, he probably knew it anyway, as she would have been assigned to his staff, primarily to run errands in the city, for Capris, it was said, seldom cared to leave the house of Kerners. I wished to be able to work closely with Veller in the house of Kerners. I was gambling on the unpleasant sense of humour, and not uncommonly found among slavers. "Do you object?" I asked. Kerners smiled. "Our physicians ascertained that she is only a red silk gal." "Well, I scarcely suppose I said that you would permit a white silk girl to go alone in the streets of R." Kerners chuckled. "Indeed not," he said. "The risk is too much, sometimes as much as 10 gold pieces." And then he leant back. 74673, he said. "The girl!" cried out the scribe. From a side entrance to the hall where she had been kept, Elizabeth Cardwell, Veller, was thrust into the room. She was dressed as she had been when I first saw her near the gate of Great R, barefoot, the yellow slave livery, the unbound dark hair, the yellow collar. She ran rapidly to a place before the stone platform, before the curule chair of Kerners, where she fell to her knees in a position of pleasure-slave, head bowed. I was amused, for she had run as a slave-girl is sometimes taught to run, with rapid short steps, her legs almost straight, her feet scarcely leaving the ground, back straight, head turned to the left, arms at her sides, palms out at 45 degrees, more of a dancer's motion than a true run. Elizabeth, I knew, would hate that. I remembered her on the plains of Turia in the land of the wagon peoples. There were few girls with her wind and stamina, her strength and vitality, few who could run at the stirrup of a warrior as well as she. How offensive she must find it, some slave-keeper's notion of the pretty hurrying of a slave-girl. "Lift your head, girl," said Kerners. She did so, and I gathered it was the first time she had actually looked on the face of the master of the house of Kerners. Her face was pale. "How long have you been with us?" asked Kerners. 9 days, master," she said. "Do you like it here?" asked Kerners. "Oh, yes, master," she said. "And do you know the penalty for lying?" asked Kerners. Elizabeth, trembling, lowered her head to the floor and crossed her wrists under her, kneeling, as it is said, to the whip. One of Kerners's men-at-arms looked at him to see if he wished him to secure her to one of the slave-rings in the base of the platform for punishment. Kerners, with a finger, indicated negativity. "Lift your head, little slave," said Kerners. Elizabeth did so. "Remove your clothing," said Kerners, and without a word Elizabeth did so, standing and pulling the loop on her left shoulder. "You are very pretty, little slave," said Kerners. "Thank you, master," she said. "And what is your name?" 74673, she responded. "No. What name would you like to be called by?" "Veller," she said, "if it pleases, master." "It's a pretty name," he said. She dropped her head. "I see," said Kenneth, "that you wear the brand of the 4 Boskhorns," she said. "Yes." "Casa, isn't it?" "No, master," she said. "Tuchuk." "Oh, where is the ring?" he asked. Tuchuk women, both slaves and free, have fixed in their noses a tiny ring of gold, small and fine, not unlike the wedding rings of earth. The ponderous bosque on which the wagon peoples live, among which are numbered the Cassars and the Tuchuks, also wear such rings, but there, of course, the ring is much larger and heavier. "My last master," she said, "Clark of the house of Clark and Fentis, removed it." "He is a fool," said Cairnes. "Such a ring is marvellous. It bespeaks the barbarian. The promise of pleasures so wild and fierce, a man of the cities could scarcely conceive of them." Elizabeth said nothing. "I had a Tuchuk girl once," said Cairnes, "a wild girl of the wagons, of whom I was fond. But when she tried to kill me, I strangled her in the chain of the house of Cairnes." He fingered the chain and medallion about his neck. "I am not truly Tuchuk," said Elizabeth. "I, too, am only a girl from the islands north of Kos, taken by pirates of Port Car, sold to a townsman, carried to and sold again in the city of Turia, and hence for 20 bosque hides traded to the Tuchuks, where I was ringed and branded." "How came you to Fentis?" asked Cairnes. "Oh, Cassars raided Tuchuk wagon," she said. "I was abducted, later sold to Turians." She spoke numbly. "I was later sold in Tao, far to the north of Turia. A year later, by slave wagon, I reached the fair of Savar near the Sadar, where I was sold to the house of Clark, from which house I and many others were fortunate enough to be purchased by the house of Cairnes in glorious hour." Cairnes leant back, seemingly satisfied. "But without the ring, no one will believe the brand of the 4 Boscarns," he smiled. "You will be regarded, my dear, as inauthentic." "I am sorry," said Elizabeth, her head down. "I will have a smith replace the ring," he said. "As master wishes." "It will not hurt much the second time," said Cairnes. Elizabeth said nothing. Cairnes turned to Capris, who stood near him. "Is she trained?" he asked. "No," said Capris. "She is red silk, but she knows almost nothing." "Slave," said Cairnes. "Yes, master," said Elizabeth. "Stand straight and place your hands behind your head, head back." She did so. "Turn slowly," ordered Cairnes. When Elizabeth had done so once, she remained standing before him as he commanded. Cairnes turned to Capris. "Was she touched by the leather?" he inquired. "The physician Flaminus conducted the test," reported Capris. "She was superb." "Excellent," said Cairnes. "You may lower your arms," he said to the girl. She did so and stood there, standing before him, her head down. "Let her be fully trained," said Cairnes to Capris. "Fully?" asked Capris. "Yes," said Cairnes, "fully." Elizabeth looked at him, startled. I had not counted on this, and nor had Elizabeth. On the other hand, there seemed to be little that could be done about it. The training, exhaustive and detailed, I knew would take months. On the other hand, it would be done presumably in the house of Cairnes. Further, such training, though it spread over a period of months, normally consumes only about 5 of the Gurian hours daily, so that the girls have time to rest, to absorb their lessons, to recreate themselves in the pools and gardens of the house. During this time, since Elizabeth was nominally of the staff of Capris, we could surely find time to be about our work, for which purpose we had arranged to enter the house of Cairnes. "Are you not grateful?" asked Cairnes, puzzled. Elizabeth dropped to her knees, head down. "I am unworthy of so great an honour, master," she said. And then Cairnes pointed to me, indicating that the girl should turn. Elizabeth did so, and suddenly, superbly, she threw her arm up before her mouth and cried out, as though just seeing me for the first time and remembering me with horror. She was marvellous. "It is he!" she cried, shuddering. "Who?" inquired Cairnes innocently. I then began to suspect that my gamble, based on the often unpleasant sense of humour common among slavers, might begin to bear fruit. Elizabeth had her head down to the stone floor. "Please, master, it is he, the assassin, who forced me in the streets to accompany him to the tavern of Spendius. Protect me, master, please, master, protect me, master."
"Is this the slave," asked Cernus sternly, "whom you forced to accompany you to this tavern of Spendius?"
"Well, I think she's the one," I admitted.
"Hateful beast!"
wept Elizabeth.
"You are only a poor little slave. Was he cruel to you?"
"Yes,"
she cried, her eyes gleaming.
"Yes."
Elizabeth, I had to admit, was a really remarkable actress. She was extremely intelligent and a talented girl as well as beautiful. I hoped she would not be too successful in her exhibition, or I might end up bubbling in a vat of boiling thalarian oil.
"Would you like me to punish him for you?" asked Cernus kindly.
Elizabeth threw him a look of incredible gratitude, her eyes wide with tears, her mouth trembling.
"Oh, yes," she wept. "Oh, please, master, punish him, punish him."
"Very well," said Cernus. "I will punish him by sending to his quarters an untrained slave girl."
"Master?"
she asked. Cernus turned to Caparus.
"When she is not in training, 74673 will be kept in the quarters of the assassin."
Caparus noted this with his stylus on his tablet.
"Oh, no," howled Elizabeth. "Please, master, no, no."
"Perhaps," said Cernus, "if your training proceeds rapidly and favourably, you may after some months find other quarters."
Elizabeth collapsed weeping before the stone platform.
"Let that be an incentive to be diligent, little slave," said Cernus.
I threw back my head and laughed, and Cernus threw back his head and laughed, pounding on the arms of the coral chair, and the men at arms too roared with laughter. And then I turned and followed a man-at-arms who would lead me to my quarters. End of chapter.